welcome. My name is Erin Mayo Adam. I'm the director of the LGBTQ Policy Center at Roosevelt House, and I'm also an associate professor of political science in the political science department here at Hunter College. And I'm delighted to introduce this evening's film, Rustin. Following the screening, we're going to have a panel discussion featuring the film's producer, Bruce Cohen, who's done many very famous films, including American Beauty, Milk, Silver Linings Playbook, and also helped produce some groundbreaking Broadway shows like The Inheritance and Slave Play. And we also have a historian from Hunter College, DeWeston Haywood, who focuses on Black masculinity and Black protest and thought as part of our panel following the film. I'll have a little bit more of an introduction for both of them when we get to that point of the evening. I'd like to begin with a super brief synopsis, and then we'll just jump right into the movie. So Rustin tells the true story of Bayard Rustin, the architect of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Rustin challenged authority, never apologized for who he was, what he believed, or who he desired, and he did not back down. He made history, and in turn, he was forgotten. Directed by DGA Award and 5-time Tony Award winner George C. Wolfe, and starring Emmy Award winner and Academy Award nominee Colman Domingo, Rustin shines a long overdue spotlight on the extraordinary man who, alongside giants like Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and Ella Baker, dared to imagine a different world and inspired a movement in a march toward freedom. As Manhola Davis wrote in the New York Times, quote, "At once a work of reclamation and celebration, Rustin seeks to put its subject front and center in the history he helped to make and from which he has at times been elided, partly because as an openly gay man, he challenged both convention and the law," unquote. We're really delighted to show this film as our opening for our fall events at Hunter College this semester. And I'd also like to thank the CUNY LGBTQ Advisory Council and its president, Mitch Drazen, for helping make this event possible, in addition to the New York City Council and the CUNY LGBTQ Consortium, which funds all of our events here at the Roosevelt House, and also our director, Harold Holzer, and our staff, our awesome AV staff especially, who make things run very seamlessly for us. So without further ado, I'd like to begin the film, and you'll see me all at the end of the event to open the Q&A. I'll just have a couple of general questions for that, but most of that will be an audience Q&A. All right, and I will see you then. All right. So we are really thrilled to have two excellent panelists with us tonight to discuss the film. First, I'd like to introduce, in just in alphabetical order, Bruce Cohen. He's an Oscar and Tony-winning, Emmy-nominated producer of film, television, theater, and live events. He won an Academy Award for Best Picture for American Beauty and earned additional Best Picture nominations for Milk and Silver Linings Playbook. He is currently serving along with Lady Gaga as co-chair of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. And this year he is a producer of The Great Lillian Hall and Zoe Kravitz's directorial debut, Blink Twice. Cohen also produced both the feature film and Broadway musical versions of Big Fish, won the Tony for Best Play in 2020 for co-producing Matthew Lopez's The Inheritance, which I actually took my class to for queer policy and politics. They really liked that play on the day before it closed for COVID, too, which was really... Fortunately, no one in the class got sick, though, so that was... and you also more recently co-produced Slave Play with Jeremy O. Harris. We also have, so thank you, Bruce Cohen, for joining us this evening. We also have with us DeWeston Haywood, who is a historian of a professor from Hunter College and a historian of 20th century American history with research and teaching interests in Black protest and protest thought, Black masculinity, Black power, and the intersections of Black culture, Black politics, and Black public spheres. His first book, Let Us Make Men, the 20th Century Black Press and a Manly Vision for Racial Advancement, moves from the rise of the modern Black press at the dawn of the 20th century to the emergence of Black power and reveals the crucial but complicated role Black male newspaper roles played in presenting certain pivotal moments in the Black freedom struggle as opportunities for Black men to stand up and be men. So we're really thrilled to have both speakers with us this evening. I'm going to ask you both to turn on your microphones. We each have a microphone, but they're all right, so I thought the way that we'd run this is I'd just ask you both a couple of questions to get things going, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A, since I'm sure you all have a lot of questions about the film. So my first question to open is for Bruce. So how did this film come together? What inspired its creation? I know you've done a lot of, or several biopics.
I had worked with Dustin Lance Black, who co-wrote the screenplay with Julian Brees on Milk. He was the writer on Milk, and he had actually mentioned to me during Milk that he was interested in doing a potential screenplay about Bayard Rustin, and there had been a fantastic documentary in the 90s about Bayard that I had seen, Brother Outsider. So I actually knew who Bayard was, and was very excited about that idea. And I said to Lance, you know, keep me in mind to produce it if it ever happens. And then much to my surprise and delight, about 15 years later maybe, Lance had a script with Julian, and he sent me the script. And as we started trying to take it around Hollywood, we learned that no one knew who Bayard Rustin was. And interestingly, Brother Outsider in the 90s had done the whole circuit of gay and lesbian film festivals. I had seen it at Outfest, the LA Gay and Lesbian Film Festival. And there was a period in the 90s where the queer community knew who Bayard was and had embraced him as an icon of ours. So it had never occurred to me that that status could be a temporary thing, and I was very surprised and saddened to learn 20 years later that he'd kind of been lost again in history, and that the queer community didn't really know who he was, many of us, and no one in Hollywood had heard of him. So I was thinking to myself, how are we going to get this movie made, and is there anyone who might know who Bayard Rustin is? And then I thought, well, I know one person who knows who Bayard Rustin is, and the person I was thinking of was President Obama, because he had given him the Presidential Medal of Freedom when he was president. And as the universe will sometimes provide things, President Obama and Mrs. Obama had opened their production company for film and television at Netflix like a month before that. So I was like, oh, I'm going to send it to the Obamas. And they, Tonya Davis, who produced the film with me, who was running their company, she loved it. She sent it to them. They loved it and said, we want this to be our first film.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And I will just say, I could go on and on about the Obamas, don't get me started, but one we really wanted to put on that last postscript, we thought it should say, Bayard Rustin was posthumously, on the 50th anniversary of the march, he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama. But President Obama said, no, I'm the executive producer of the film, that will look self-serving, and you can't put my name on there, so.
Well, that sounds really fortuitous. Yeah, and it's really interesting how movement history kind of changes over time. I know I teach, as I said, I teach a queer policy and politics class, and in New York City, you'd be surprised how many students haven't heard of even basic LGBTQ icons in K through 12 schools. So I'm not surprised, but I am surprised. With that said, I'd like to move more to history situating the film within Black protest and masculinity, and I'd like to ask a question for DeWeston. Rustin focuses in on many of the most well-known leaders of the civil rights movement, not only Bayard Rustin, but MLK Jr., Roy Wilkins, and Medgar Evers. Can you tell us a bit about the construction of Black masculinity within the civil rights movement at the historic moment depicted in the film? Specifically, I'm thinking about how it relates to the role of Black male leaders in moments like the 1963 March on Washington.
Yeah. So always is complex. I was talking to colleagues before this. and it's difficult to simplify historical figures in one sentence or just a few. I'll do my best, right? So again, complex. This question of black masculinity or masculinities, right, at that moment or even now. So a couple of things. One is that part of that question has a lot to do with jockeying for racial leadership. And it was the case that, the Big Six or the Big Ten, that jockeying and the rivalries were deep, even to the extent, in some cases, of some of those leaders, collaborating may be a strong word, making themselves available to the FBI and to the CIA where needed to provide information about other leaders who could pose a threat to their leadership, right? So this is how deep it could go. I don't want to name any names, but Roy Wilkins could be one of those people at different times. And so take someone like Bayard Rustin, who, again, talking with colleagues earlier before this moment, where we could all agree that Rustin was unapologetic about not only his sexuality, but also his politics. And the two intersected often. He was in and out of movements, of activist circles, sometimes forced out, sometimes he resigned. And he's between sort of, I'd say maybe this political exile that he, I think, well understood how to navigate, strategize from, at different times go back into. And I think he cultivated a certain sense of masculinity, even as we might think in that particular moment, that his masculinity was compromised as, Pasadena as this haunting specter always to his politics. So a complex approach to wrestling with what happened in Pasadena, but also figuring out ways to sort of navigate in the shadows and still strategize, organize, politicize, his power of persuasion to convince someone like a king, as it was represented in the film, to find a way to convince him in ways that were also detrimental to his leadership, right? And sort of playing on ego at the same time that he needs him to be a part of the leadership. So I think that Rustin was this brilliant political theorist, as much as he was this political activist, as much as he was a leader on LGBTQ rights before his time, right? And there are a number of ways that we may underappreciate those kinds of contributions too. That on one hand, he's this figure who isn't supposed to be where he is at the time that he is there, right? But is needed as this architect, as this organizer who can only do what he does. Like, he's the only guy who's called in to make this happen. And then also offer political theory, as represented in the film, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to police officers who got a lesson in Gandhian philosophy, right? And he was quick to do that, whether it was Gandhi or Thoreau, some of his socialist, communist leanings as well, in addition to, I think, black working class thought. Bringing those all together along with his Quaker upbringing to produce, I think, a brilliant political mind that saw masculinity as just one thing to navigate among many others, right?
Let me just quickly add, because it goes directly to how deep the rivalries were. Pasadena, Bayard's arrest record had disappeared. No one had ever mentioned Pasadena in the 20 years since it happened when the march came up. And it is established historical fact that about a week before, 2 weeks before the march, at that meeting of the Big Ten, Adam Clayton Powell brings up Pasadena to Roy Wilkins and Bayard Rustin at the meeting in an attempt to get Bayard Rustin thrown out of the march, which you see failed as it happened. 2 weeks later, the weekend before the march, Strom Thurmond has Pasadena as a arrest record and mentions it on the floor of the Capitol and to the press. So it's been an open historical question. How did Strom Thurmond know about Pasadena? And is it a coincidence that Adam Clayton Powell had Pasadena and then 2 weeks later Strom Thurmond has Pasadena? One of the pluses of working with the Obamas is that everything has to be very rigorously vetted. So we showed the script to many of the leading historians of the time, and we wanted to know if it was okay to infer, even though we don't say it, but we infer that Adam Clayton Powell gave Strom Thurmond the Pasadena arrest record, which when you think about that for a moment, that he would, that Adam Clayton Powell would want anything to do with Strom Thurmond. And what the historians all said to us was, while there is no historical proof that Adam Clayton Powell did give Strom Thurmond the arrest record, it's certainly plausible enough, and it has never been disproved, so you're welcome to go ahead and keep it in the script like that.
Wow, that's fascinating. Since we're talking about masculinities and identity, I wanted to, I guess one of the things I found fascinating about the film was the way it brought in various intersectional identities, not only Bayard Rustin as a gay black man, but also prominent civil rights figures like Ella Baker, who are just critical. I mean, especially as I teach civil rights movement at Hunter College in New York City. So can you tell us a bit about how and why it was so important to include the multiplicity of intersectional identities that are included in the film? And then also for DeWeston, what sort of intersectional marginalization is going on at this point in the civil rights movement? I'm thinking here about the critiques that ultimately emerge in the 1980s and 90s as a result of that.
Well, for Lance and Julian doing the script in the 2020s, it was extremely problematic for them that there were no women in the story. And as they dug deeper in the research, they rediscovered, which people had known at the time, but seemed much more shocking now, did truly not a single woman speak at the March on Washington? Two of them sung. Were there no women on the leadership committee of the March on Washington? And we don't explicitly circle back to it, but Ella Baker, who was on the planning committee, you hear about it, but she refused to come to the march. A lot of the women leaders didn't even attend the March on Washington because they were so rightly infuriated that they had no role. So we were like, how do we tell this story with no women? And then we said, well, let's at least tell the story about why there are no women and how there were no women. So we included that storyline in the film.
Yes, I mean, Baker's a great example of this because she had tensions with King and SELC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's organization. For several years, she was a field organizer, responsible almost single-handedly for making sure that organization had roots and grassroots extensions as far as the South and North, right? And raised the point to King and other leaders of SELC that the leadership was too, King-centered, and that the leadership was too male-centered, and that it was too singularly centered, right? She believed in group-centered leadership. And this would, of course, come out over the years. She would break with SELC, go on to be a part of the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960. So by 1963, she's firmly sort of in and out, too, of connections with King and that kind of cadre of male leadership. But again, it returns us to this point of how important, on one hand, leadership as conceptualized as a black male preserve, but also that in the context of how we conceive of leadership in the U.S. and in the West in general, right? That there's a singular male figure who leads. And what happens, you know, we get the Big Six and the Big Ten largely because of that notion that if we're going to, you know, lead the largest, at the time, nonviolent demonstration in America's capital, that men had to lead, men had to speak, and it's a fight for jobs and freedom, civil rights, but also this idea of, you know, the importance of masculine leadership, as particularly black male masculine leadership, to making claims on the rights of citizens, right? So that, you know, you get this moment in the film that I think was represented very well, right, this was an ongoing critique raised by women, some men too, and it would come to a head by the 1970s and 1980s, where you have the emergence of black feminist organizations, though the scholarship had existed for years. I mean, one of the points that you raise about intersectionality, we have these kinds of terms now to name phenomenon that existed decades, if not centuries before, right? I mean, one of the first black women to name intersectionality without calling it that, right, was in the 1890s, 1880s. Anna Julia Cooper, right, who would, you know, frame what would later become that term intersectionality. So in addition to wrestling with questions and activism around civil rights, racial justice, you also have these questions of gender, sexuality, masculinity, femininity, and everything in between, and who, what image or person, figure do you want to represent your claim on citizenship, and that claim to be as legitimate as it can be, right, when you present your case to the American public. And so this is where Roy Wilkins, as you know, represented in the film, but also historically, A. Philip Randolph, Adam Clayton Powell, that, you know, A. Philip Randolph represented an aging generation of civil rights and working class activism that, you know, in many ways he had proposed, you know, he had proposed the March on Washington in 1940, and that led to the desegregation of the armed forces. But you know, in some ways, he wanted to see that vision materialize. And here, again, is where Rustin becomes critical. You'd find him pop up somewhere else in the world even, right? So, you know, he could be expelled in New York or Montgomery, but then end up in Algeria just a couple of months or years later, and sort of everywhere and nowhere at once. And that was sort of the, I think, the skill, the brilliance, the just how he did his activism.
And to Bayard's credit, the band of kids that he put together, who are actually the ones who did the work that put on the march, was a group of men and women together. And a lot of the women portrayed are all based on real people, Rochelle and Dory and Joyce. And to your point, they were literally 18 then, and they did go on to be some of the leaders of the movement once feminism hit and women had more of an opportunity in the 70s and 80s. And in fact, the woman that you hear, the girl really, that you hear referred to as Eleanor, that's Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, got her start working for Rustin at the march when she was 18 years old.
Oh, wow. Well, I have more questions, but I would really like to just open it up to the audience at this point to ask questions about the film. We have someone going around with a microphone too, so I'll point out audience members and they'll come to you. So I see right here, right? Yes.
Mine is not actually a question. It's just that about Adam Clayton Powell. I can't resist saying, just remember, he got his in the end.
He's still my example of expulsion from Congress when I teach Introduction to American Government. So, yeah.
Well, and I'll just add Jeffrey Wright, who of course is one of our generation's great actors. That's a very accurate portrayal. That's kind of what he looked like. That's certainly what he sounded like. Keep the faith was his big expression. He was known to say that as he was exiting meetings, which is sort of, you're not sure exactly what he means, but kind of, keep the faith, baby. Yes, thank you.
And I mean, the arrogance and bravado and you know, sort of the vengeance, again, this jockeying for leadership and how territorial a lot of these leaders were. And this isn't just to say that this is the case for black men too. I think, you know, they're scholars. Steve Estes is a great example of his work to show that this question of masculinity was the case also for white men who were leaders of a different kind of movement, right? Segregationist movement, citizens councils, the KKK, where they also raised these same points about masculinity and attacked anyone who represented anything other than what they defined as masculinity. So they're hunting in real ways and figurative ones too, politically, who is going to lead on their side as well, right? So yeah, you get an Adam Clayton Powell who is going to, you know, to your point earlier about Strom Thurmond, again, collaborate. I want to resist, but certainly makes himself available for some of those, you know, police, FBI inquiries, right?
Hi, my name is Peter Goodman. It's a wonderful movie, first of all. I'd like Clarence Taylor, who taught at Baruch, is a friend of mine, and he wrote a biography of Galamison. And the Galamison boycotts were in February of '64. I was wondering whether there's any interconnection between Rustin and Galamison. Secondly, in the '68 strike, which Al Shanker led for the Union, it was talked about as being a terrible racist strike, yet Rustin strongly supported the strike and was one of Shanker's major sort of mentors. And lastly, I have a cassette of Bayard Rustin singing spirituals. I was at some event in his apartment with Walter.
Oh, wow.
His apartment is like a museum of Afro-American history, just was spectacular. But I was wondering whether you ever considered using some of the songs from that cassette or other cassettes, because his voice was spectacular.
Well, the apartment where Bayard lives in the movie, which is in the 20s in Chelsea, looks coincidentally similar to Bayard's real apartment, and the reason why that is because Walter Nagel, who was Bayard's partner for the last 10 years of his life, lives in that apartment to this day. So I have been in that apartment, as has the production designer, the director. Many of Bayard's artifacts, his artwork is all still in the apartment. And well, we feature the album, the Medieval Spirituals on the Lute, which was one of George C. Wolfe, the director's, favorite examples of what a true Renaissance man Bayard really was. And he sings that little bit of the song, but we didn't, that's as much as we used of that part of his life. But Bayard had a lot of interesting political views throughout his life. He got very involved in a wide variety of issues beyond civil rights. He shortly thereafter, shortly after the march, he ran the A. Philip Randolph Foundation. So he was probably executive director of that in 1964, but I don't know the exact answers to whether he was involved in that boycott or not.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with those moments in his activism. It's again, he's everywhere and nowhere at once, right? And if I can imagine that if you're talking about a successful, well-orchestrated demonstration, I wouldn't be surprised that that he's there, having his hands in some level of the organization, the organizing of the event, and I think this was the case for him. It's hard to sort of place, like, drawing from Black feminist scholars and activists who say, none of us lead single issue lives, right? And so he's going to be fighting for civil rights, fighting for human rights. He's going to be resisting the dropping of a nuclear bomb in Algeria. He's going to be a diehard radical pacifist. At the same time that he's not going to join activists in the anti-war movement, right? I mean, and so just when you think you figured him out, you haven't. And that's because, again, we don't lead single issue lives. And then number two, all of us, whether we're talking about Rustin or now, right, that history impinges on our lives. And what is happening at one particular moment can shape the way you think about or act upon a particular historical moment that could change dramatically a week or a month or 10 years later, even though some of your core principles and values remain consistent. And so it's just hard to pin down, like, okay, well, I tell my students, and I think you can appreciate this too, what year are we talking about when we're talking about anyone? Right, and so I think it's critical that we identify those years to say, okay, he was here in '54, he was here in '63, he was here in '82, that kind of thing, right? And again, if you follow his writing in addition to his activism, I think again as this adept, brilliant political theorist, so wedded to not only the theory, but most importantly, the practice. And so unapologetic about all of it, in addition to his sexual identity, right?
Through the storyline, there's a tension about whether his being gay would become public and derail the movement. And about 10 days before the march, Adam Clayton Powell raises the Pasadena event. It doesn't derail it because that's internal, but then just before the weekend, I think you said before the march, it becomes public when Strom Thurmond makes it public. They chose to stick with him, which I think is interesting. What comes to mind is three possibilities. One is they're going to defend him for being gay, which I doubt 60 years ago was going to be the case. There could have been personal loyalty, perhaps, or they just thought that allowing it to become an event might derail the march. So I'm just wondering if you could shed any light on that.
Well, it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts. I mean, we feel that the way we've portrayed it is pretty accurate to the best of our knowledge. Martin Luther King Jr. had thrown him under the bus in 1960, which caused him from being expelled from the movement. They had been extremely close. Bayard was a mentor to MLK, and Bayard is how MLK knew about Gandhi and the nonviolence movement. And then after not speaking for a few years, they got very close again, putting the march on, sort of exactly as portrayed. So I believe and appreciate, and I'm sort of sticking with the story of the film, which is that MLK, he had the chance to do right by his friend the second time, and the second time he did. He understood that if one of us, unless we're all free, no one's free, and that he did the right thing and he stood up for Bayard. But then that story was put aside. It was not in anyone's interest. It was not in Martin Luther King Jr.'s interest. It was not in the civil rights movement's interest, which was extremely homophobic at that point, in addition to being extremely misogynistic at that point, as were all male movements. Let's certainly not pretend that the white movements were doing any better. That was not a story they wanted told. And I actually, I do feel like it's an interesting example, though, of how detrimental it can be when things are put away, because the fact that MLK Jr. was one of the great allies of the LGBT movement 5 years before Stonewall, and no one knows that. I wonder how history might have been different if that had been more publicly known in the period from 1963 moving forward.
Yeah, the sort of that break between King and Rustin was devastating to Rustin. Largely for the points that you raise of how instrumental Rustin had been in mentoring King and really introducing him to Gandhian philosophy and mass civil disobedience that King was familiar with sort of in passing until, again, Rustin's mentorship. So imagine that you've helped King become king, right? And he terminates that working relationship because of those liabilities. And I mean, much to the point of sort of captured in the film so well of the moment when the dogs were sicked on the kids in Birmingham and the hoses, and he, his retort to his colleague at the time was, shame on you for, calling out King. Is this moment of defense of his friend, his mentee, his student? Not to mention too, King had kind of for lack of a better word, a tense, to some extent, relationship with his own father. And you can imagine what, having someone else in your life to, take on a fatherly role, if not sort of an avuncular role, where one's father might have been a different kind of teacher. And Rustin could have fulfilled that part of that part of King's life too. And then to cut that off, I think rocked Rustin, though it did not stop his activism. And so again, I mean, here are the complexities of historical figures. Again, when we think we have figured them out, something dramatic, if not radical, can reshape their lives. And just when you think, okay, he's done with King, he's devastated, You know, they're working together again to produce this moment in history. And again, I mean, I think on King's side, King realizing here, enemies of the movement were always looking for liabilities. They were always looking for something that they thought could discredit the movement. And even when they didn't have anything, they made it up, right? Some of you may be familiar with COINTELPRO by the late 1960s, but many of the tactics the FBI used in the late 1960s had been cultivated and practiced on black leaders really since the 1930s, if not 1940s, right? So I mean, the FBI has been at this for a long time. You know, again, not to get to go down the path, but you could think of Hoover and the Palmer raids as early as the 1910s, right? Garvey in the 1920s. So again, the FBI has been at this for a minute. So even when there wasn't anything valid, the FBI would plant stories in the news and curry favor with different reporters and journalists, right, to produce these kinds of stories. So a liability was any and everything. And of course, Rustin sticks out like a sore thumb in that regard. But again, I think this is Rustin's brilliance, that he's going to use that in different ways to still sort of navigate and organize and perform as an activist in these complex ways that I you know, again, it's sort of difficult to pinpoint where he is at a particular time, though he never really stops being engaged.
Thank you so much for that. I think we have time for one more question from the audience, I see.
What led Roy Wilkins and perhaps some other black leaders to support the march after opposing it for so long?
Well, that also was pretty accurately displayed in the movie. It's because MLK came on board. Rustin realized, with the help of his associates, that if he got Martin Luther King, then they wouldn't really have a choice. And there is that moment in the movie where they, you know, the NAACP has said no. Rustin has gone to get King. King's on board. Whether the NAACP came back or not, the march was going on at that point. But Roy Wilkins and the NAACP quickly decided. And actually, that's true as it was portrayed as well, is that Roy and the NAACP, the way they found out that MLK was on board was they saw him on television announcing the march. And they came on board pretty quickly after that.
Yeah, just real quick. You don't want to be left out of history. Right? And I mean, once it looked like this was going to happen, Wilkins and others didn't want their name not to be mentioned alongside the rest of history.
And I'll just quickly add, no one called it the NAACP until the 70s. It was always the NAACP. And so some smart writer and historian found that for us, and we, of course, were saying NAA because that's what you thought, and someone smartly corrected us and said in 1963 the only thing that they called it was the NAACP.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. Well, thank you both for this wonderful panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have two quick announcements of upcoming events. We are going to have an event celebrating Ken Sherrill's impact on New York State politics next week on Thursday. Ken Sherrill was a professor of political science at Hunter who passed away recently, and he was the first openly gay elected official in New York State. So there'll be some elected officials at that event who were former students of his, including Scott Stringer, who's announced his campaign for mayor, and Andrew Guinardes, who's a state senator for South Brooklyn. We'll also be showing a screening of the Laramie Project on October 9th at 5:30 p.m. with a Q&A with Moises Kaufman afterwards. And that event was brought about thanks to a lot of push from students who wanted us to bring a policy event that would connect past iterations of violence against the LGBTQ community to contemporary iterations targeting the transgender community. So we'll be discussing that at that screening. Thank you all for tonight's event. I hope to see you at future events.